Hey there. Today I want to talk about something that is incredibly energy zapping, and that is taking things personally in your marriage, but really in any relationship. If you find yourself hurt or angry or defensive over your husband's tone of voice, maybe he forgot errands that you asked him to do, or even just his facial expressions, keep watching for the sake of your mental health and the health of your marriage. I've spent the last 10 years learning how to regulate my emotional responses instead of taking everything personally and letting those hijack my happiness. And today I want to share with you what helped me to stop taking things so personally. The first major breakthrough is learning that your husband's behavior is about him and not about you. It seems really obvious when you say it out loud, but for years, years, I interpreted everything my husband did through the lens of what it meant about me, what it meant about him, and what it meant about our relationship. If he was quiet, I assumed he was upset with me. If he forgot to do something I asked him to do, I took it as proof that he just didn't care about my needs. If he seemed stressed, I thought, maybe I'm failing as a wife. Last week, I had come home from work and we barely said hello to each other, and he disappeared out into the shop for a few hours. My old self would have said things like, he's avoiding me, he doesn't want to spend time with me anymore. I would have felt incredibly rejected and probably picked a fight later just to express that hurt without actually telling him what was on my mind. Instead, I remembered this principle: his behavior is about him and not about me. And when he finally came inside, I said, "Did you have a rough day?" Turned out he had made a mistake on a trade and he needed some time to process that. It had nothing to do with me. The shift in perspective is just recognizing that people's actions usually stem from their own internal landscape, and it's not necessarily a reflection on you. And that is incredibly freeing. So the next time that you start feeling like you have been personally attacked or offended, ask yourself, what else could this mean? If you truly want to dig deeper with your emotional responses, learn to identify those triggers and those core wounds. We all have sensitive spots that hurt more than objectively they should because they touch an old wound or maybe an insecurity. And these are called your emotional triggers. And they're likely landmines in many of your relationships. For me, feeling ignored was a massive trigger that dated back to way back to my childhood. When Jared would be on his phone while I was talking to him, it wasn't just like an irritation, it was this deep hurt that was way disproportionate. And this trigger would launch me into defensive behaviors. I would be like snapping at him, making passive aggressive comments, or completely withdrawing emotionally. Once I was able to identify that pattern, I could separate the present situation from my past wounds. And now, when that familiar hurt rises up, I can think, is this my old wound surfacing? And Jared looking at his phone, it doesn't mean that I'm unimportant or unworthy of attention, even though that's what the emotional part of my brain was telling me. I actually have a running list of emotional triggers in a journal, and along with the core belief, is what each of them represents to me. So, for example, being ignored, the core belief is I'm not important. For not being consulted on decisions, the core belief was my opinion doesn't matter. For arguing, it meant he could abandon me. It could be a threat to our relationship. So, how about for you? Try making your own list this week. And when you feel disproportionately hurt by something your husband or someone else does, ask yourself, what core belief is being activated right now? Just identifying these patterns reduces their power over you. What I'm about to share with you right now is a defining line of where you can take control of your emotion or your emotional responses, and it's super duper simple. Implementing a pause between the stimulus and your response. In psychology, it's called the buffer zone, is when you intentionally pause before reacting when you're emotionally triggered. This tiny space allows you to choose your response so you're back in control rather than being controlled by your initial reaction. I really used to pride myself on being someone who says it like it was, or I don't hold things in, which basically meant that I reacted to everything immediately and pretty intensely. If Jared said something that hurt my feelings within seconds, he knew about it. There was no processing time. It was just immediate reaction. And this led to a lot of unnecessary arguments and really hurt feelings on both sides. Now I like to use a technique which I call 555, which is when I feel that surge of emotion, I step back because I can already feel my nervous system taking over. There's tightness in my chest, there's heat rising to my face, and I'll take 5 seconds to breathe, ask myself 5 questions, and then consider 5 possible interpretations of what just happened. The 5 questions I like to ask myself are: am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I stressed about something else? Is this a triggering old wound? And what is it that I actually need right now? A tiny pause can change the whole trajectory of your evening. So try implementing your own pause practice this week. Even if it's like 3 seconds, it can make a huge difference between reaction and response. The next approach is called charitable interpretation, also known as assuming the best. This means you're intentionally choosing the most generous possible explanation for your husband or whoever for their behavior. It's the opposite of what our brains naturally do, which is really to just assume the worst about what it means about us, what it means about them, what it means about the relationship. And when, let's say, like your husband forgets an important date, you might automatically think, well, he just doesn't care about me. And the charitable interpretation would ask, well, what's another explanation that assumes good intentions? This doesn't mean making excuses for genuinely hurtful or harmful behavior. Like, this doesn't apply to that. It means recognizing that in the absence of clear evidence, we get to choose our interpretation. So why not choose one that feels better and preserve that connection between you? The beautiful thing about charitable interpretation is that it creates a space for actual communication rather than accusations and assumptions. And usually the reality is that it's their behavior is much less personal than the story that we've created in our heads. So try practicing charitable interpretation with one small incident this week. When something happens that you would normally take personally or consciously make it mean something bad about you, generate 3 alternative explanations that assume good intentions. Lastly, and possibly the most important, is recognizing that your emotional well being cannot depend primarily on your husband's behavior. For years, I was on that emotional roller coaster based entirely on how Jared acted towards me or, again, anybody in a relationship. If he was attentive and affectionate, I felt secure and happy. If he was distant or maybe critical, I felt worthless and unloved. My emotional state was completely contingent on his behavior, which meant I had effectively outsourced my happiness to someone who, let's be honest, has his own struggles and limitations. So it really isn't fair to put your happiness on another person. True emotional regulation means developing internal stability that exists regardless of what others do. It means having multiple sources of validation, purpose, and joy in your life so that your husband's moods or actions don't determine your emotional weather. This has been the longest life journey for me, but I have started building what therapists would call an emotional self-sufficiency through practices like daily affirmations that reminds me that my worth comes from God and not other people, taking time to rest and reset, pursuing personal interests that give me a sense of accomplishment, and deciding ahead of time of how I want to show up around other people. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is journaling to heal old wounds that make me very vulnerable to taking things personal. Look, freeing yourself from taking things personal in your marriage is one of the greatest gifts you can give to yourself, to your husband, and to your relationship together. Start with just one of these strategies this week, whether it's remembering that his behavior is about him and not about you. It could be identifying your emotional triggers, creating a pause before reacting, practicing that charitable interpretation, or building your emotional self sufficiency. As you develop these skills, you'll find yourself feeling more peaceful, less defensive, and just more capable of the kind of loving connection that brought you together in the first place.